basically the background of this issue, plus what are the political options available. So I'll start off by talking about the historical context. I'm sure many of you have a very good idea of the historical context, so I'll go through that section very, very quickly. That will be followed by my own thoughts on the political context, plus the political options available to try to resolve the unhappiness in Sabah and Sarawak over the MA63 issue. Then I'll round up my lecture by giving a very, very short summary on where I think things are headed. So in terms of the grievances, like I said, I'll go through this very quickly because many of you have attended all the previous seminars on this issue. So I don't need to go into great details. But basically, if you look at the sort of unhappiness expressed by the people of Sabah and Sarawak, they can be grouped together basically into 5 key areas. The first one is that there's a lot of argument about whether the people of Sabah and Sarawak back in 62, 63 actually gave a real consent to the establishment of the Federation of Malaysia. The second area of contention is, of course, the 20 points and promise of autonomy. The third area where there's a lot of unhappiness is the status of Sabah and Sarawak in the Malaysian Federation. The fourth area is federal intervention in state politics of Sabah and Sarawak. And the fifth area is unhappiness or grievances over the export of Malayan political model to Sabah and Sarawak. So in terms of the consent thing, as I mentioned, there is a lot of unhappiness over whether there was a proper process held to get the wishes of the people of Sabah and Sarawak when it comes to the Federation of Malaysia, the proposal. There is a lot of historical evidences, including paperwork that shows that the entire process was driven by Whitehall and Tunku Abdul Rahman. And during the initial stage, at least the people of Sabah and Sarawak were absolutely not consulted. And the other key evidence that we have is that there was a key meeting held in London between the British PM Macmillan and Tunku Abdul Rahman in 1962, where they lay out the time frame for the federation to be established. So in other words, the whole process to create the Federation of Malaysia was not dependent on, for example, the Cobalt Commission or the UN survey. It was all decided in London between Tunku Abdul Rahman and Whitehall. We also have to see the formation of the Federation of Malaysia as part of the wider context of the Cold War, the UN push for decolonization, and of course, the British slowly moving to the East of Suez policy. So the argument is very simple. UK wanted to get out of Southeast Asia, so they needed to create a political entity to bring all the territories together. So you remember back in the 50s and 60s, the UK controlled Malaya, Singapore, North Borneo, Brunei, and Sarawak. So if you were sitting in London, obviously during the Cold War era, you're not going to allow all these territories to become independent, basically 5 new countries, right? So it was much easier to bring all of them together into a single country. So that's basically what the British did. They wanted to create a Federation of Malaysia where all these territories will come together as a single new country. The second point of unhappiness is, of course, the 20 points and what the people in Sabah and Sarawak call the blocking promises. So in terms of the key items of the 20 points, the first one is, of course, dealing with religion. Islam's status as a national religion was supposed not applicable to Sabah and Sarawak. But of course, Sabah changed its state constitution to make Sabah the official state religion. Second area is that immigration was to be at the absolute discretion of the state government. The third item is Borneanization of the civil service. In other words, when the senior British officials left the civil service, they're supposed to be replaced by people from Sabah and Sarawak. The fourth item is no modification of safeguards granted under 20 points, obviously without the agreement of the Sabah and Sarawak state governments. Fifth item, there'll be no right to secede from the Federation. Another item was that the indigenous people of Sabah and Sarawak were to be on par with the Malay community in Malaya. In other words, the special position. And of course, the final thing was that Sabah and Sarawak was to be given a high degree of autonomy. So if you were to ask people in Sabah and Sarawak, have the federal government kept to any of these promises? Most people will say that by and large, they only kept to the promise of immigration. Immigration is still absolute discretion under the state government, but things like modernization, safeguards, all these other things has been modified by the federal government without consulting the Sabah and Sarawak governments. And of course, in terms of the unwritten, broken political promises, you have to remember that back in 62, 63, during the consultation phase, a lot of the leaders, the local, native, and grassroots leaders, were actually taken for a tour of Malaya and Singapore. And one of the things that was made very explicit to them was that if they help to form the Federation of Malaysia, then there'll be rapid development of Sabah and Sarawak, and they'll be on par with the economic development found in Singapore and Malaya. The other thing that unhappiness is, of course, the indigenous people were promised that they'll be part of the special position of the Malays in the constitution. But if you speak to some groups among the indigenous people of Sabah and Sarawak, some of them are complaining that they are not on equal. They are sort of regarded as second or third class Putra. And of course, the thing that you read in the newspaper every day is, of course, the unhappiness over the ownership of the oil and gas resources. As you know, Sabah and Sarawak are major oil and gas producing states, and many people in both states are very unhappy that the state received very little money, 5%, and that the bulk of the money is so-called stolen and taken over for the development of Peninsular Malaysia. So people talk about all the major projects that was funded by Petronas. For example, Putrajaya was funded by Petronas, KLCC was funded by Petronas. So all this money, oil and gas money, has been used to build huge projects in Peninsular Malaysia at the expense of infrastructure projects in Sabah and Sarawak. Now, the third item in terms of the status of Sabah and Sarawak in the Malaysian Federation. So every year around this time, around Hari Merdeka on the 31st of August, there's always a question about how people in Malaya calculate the date. So if you Google the word Hari Merdeka 2022, you'll find it all over Google. People put the date 65. When the actual historical fact is that the Federation of Malaysia was formed in 1963, and therefore the correct date is actually 59. So many people in Sabah and Sarawak think that it's a huge disrespect to the actual date of the formation when Malayan counts the date of independence from 1957. Second thing is, of course, the Constitution Amendment. People are talking about the 1/3 seats, and they talk about autonomy and respect for religious freedom. And of course, they talk about the respect for cultural diversity rather than a Malay-centric approach to culture in Malaysia. The other thing that they talk about when they talk about the status, they talk about whether history is properly taught in Malaysian schools. If you look at history taught in Form 4, Tingkatan 4 or 5, you find that very little is devoted to Sabah and Sarawak. And the problem is that it's also written from a certain angle. So many people in Sabah and Sarawak are worried about whether the real history is taught, and whether the real history is taught, especially about the road towards the formation of the Federation. And of course, there are also complaints about whether that Malayans are actually looking down on Sabahans and Sarawakians. So if you speak to Sabahans and Sarawakians living in the Malaya in Peninsula, a lot of them say that they've experienced feeling that they are being looked down upon by people from Peninsular Malaysia. So you all heard of the joke where a lot of people think that, in Sabah and Sarawak, there were people in those states living in jungle and living in tree houses, which is absolutely not true. Now, in terms of federal intervention in state politics, I don't have to go through with this. It is quite clear that the federal government has intervened, especially in Sabah, to ensure that the Muslims or the local Malays are getting the power. This includes replacing the chief ministers or the chief ministers that they think is not supportive of this idea, or also the chief ministers who go against the federal government. Now, in terms of Sabah, I think the people of Sabah, in terms of the federal intervention, I think they're especially angry about a thing called Project M. sometimes called Project IC. And this is the program where roughly 1/3 of the Sabah residents born outside Sabah were given Malaysian identity cards and citizenship. So if you look at the statistics, it is quite clear that from 1970 to 2010, Sabah's population increased in a very abnormal way by 390%. It is not possible that this is the natural growth. So in other words, what happened was that a great number of Muslims were imported into Sabah from Mindanao, especially Mindanao, Indonesia. And what happened was that they permanently altered the local politics in Sabah. So you can see in 1976, the native community in Sabah had a majority in the Dewan Undangan Negeri. They had 22 seats. But by 2006, it was a Muslim majority state. You had 36 Muslim seats. And the Kedazan Dusun ended up with only 18 seats. There's a mistake in the slides. Huh? So what happened in Sabah was that now that it's a Sabah is a Muslim majority state. The only outcome for any elections in Sabah since the late 1980s and 1990s is that the non-Muslim Bumiputra in Sabah can never recapture power. So the only outcome for any elections in Sabah is either you get an all-Muslim government or Muslim plus government. Finally, the unhappiness stems from the export of the Malayan political model to Sabah and Sarawak. As you know, the classic Malayan political model is based on race and religion. But these two items is not as sharp as in Malaya when you apply to Sabah and Sarawak. For the simple reason that both states are very multiracial, there's lots of diversity, and there's no single ethnic group that dominates the political process like you do on the peninsula. But yet there has been a great push by the Malay establishment in the peninsula to export this model to Sabah and Sarawak. In terms of the diversity, one of the things, the reason why there's a strong backlash over this model is, of course, that if you go to Sabah and Sarawak, you'll find that many of the people there are actually from mixed families. In Sabah, they actually have a special category, for example, called the Sino-Kedazan, is actually an official category. And of course, in Sarawak, there are many communities where there are Muslims and non-Muslims within the same family. Perfect example of that is the Melanau community, where half of the community are Muslims and the other half are Christians and other religious beliefs. So that's the reason why issues like Allah, which is very, very controversial in Peninsular Malaysia, is really not an issue in Sabah and Sarawak. So for example, in Sabah, you've got the Sabah Chief Minister attending Christian parties, Christmas party, where Christian songs are sung, and this is widely regarded as a non-issue. The other thing, of course, is that when it comes to this political model based on race and religion, there's an overemphasis on political Islam. And this leads to the non-Muslim Bumiputra, such as the Ibans in Sarawak and the KDM in Sabah, who feels that they're being marginalized because they are not Muslims. So let me quickly move to another section of my talk, which is the political context, before I talk about the political options available. So in terms of the political context of MA63, although the issue MA63 has always been there, it has sort of become a key political issue after 2008. So the reasons why it became a big issue after 2008 was because for the very first time since Malaysia came into being, the UMNO and Barisan Nasional required the MPs from Sabah and Sarawak to stay in power. So that's the reason why in 2009, Malaysia Day was declared a public holiday, and then Prime Minister appointed the Speaker and the Deputy Speakers for Parliament are all people from Sabah and Sarawak. And he also increased the number of Sabah and Sarawak people in the cabinet. So you can see that before 2013, there was only one PBB ministers. In 2013, after the election, there were 4 PBB ministers. On top of that, of course, Najib set up the MA committee process to deal with the MA grievances that we're talking about this morning. You move on to 2018, you can see that, again, this issue became a key issue. What is interesting is that for the first time in Malaysia's political history, in terms of the big groups contesting to form the government, Pakatan Harapan actually put Sabah and Sarawak as one of the top 5 pillars in its election manifesto. If you were to go back before 2018, Sabah and Sarawak hardly featured any of the election manifesto, and certainly not any item in any of the Barisan National campaign or the opposition campaign. So after Pakatan won power, of course, they got VK Liu from Sabah to set up a new MA63 committee with a specific task to try to resolve the issue in 12 months. So basically, they follow the same process as Najib. An MA committee was set up at the federal level and at the state level in Kuching, Kota Kinabalu, but they expanded the membership and they had 2 subcommittees underneath. So basically, after discussion, they came up with 21 issues that they wanted to resolve. Out of the 21 issues, 17 issues were resolved. But what is important to note about this committee is that some of the issues that they're trying to deal with are actually not related to the original MA63 issues, right? Things like oil and gas. But basically, the issue could not proceed because Pakatan lost power. But more importantly, it is my argument that then Prime Minister Mahathir was not really fully on board in dealing with this issue because he was not really in favor of granting more rights and power to Sabah and Sarawak. Mahathir is somebody who believes in centralization. He doesn't believe in decentralization. It was also during this period, just recently, that we saw the rise of state nationalism, especially GPS. As many of you know, after the fall of the Barisan National Government in 2018, the Sarawak Barisan National immediately became GPS. So GPS plays a crucial role, even though they're part of the federal government, they're not part of a formal coalition member. But they were crucial in the formation of both the Muhyiddin government and the Ismail Sabri government. So you can see without GPS, this government would not survive. And return, of course, in terms of the demands made to the federal government are forced to cave in on items like the Petronas tax issue, and also calling Sabah and Sarawak administratively as a wilayah rather than a negeri. And of course, the Sarawak chief minister now is called Premier. This is only possible because the Malay political establishment is divided in Peninsular Malaysia. So right now in Peninsular Malaysia, it is clear that the Malay political establishment is divided between Bersatu, between UMNO, between PAS and PKR. And in some ways, I would argue that GPS became even more powerful after the state election of 2021, where GPS absolutely won a super majority in the Sarawak state elections. So under both the Muhyiddin Ismail Sabri government, they also carry on with the MA63 committee. Now the minister in charge is, of course, Dr. Mat Songkili from Sabah, and the deputy is from Sarawak. One of the items I think is important to recognize here is that thus far, the entire process has been kept secret. I'm one of the people who says that this should not be the case because there's really nothing that the committee deals with that have security implications for the country. So in fact, a lot of this should actually be reported or done in the open because there's really nothing to hide. I think it's very important that the people get involved, especially the people of Sabah and Sarawak, understand the process rather than just leave it behind closed doors. So one of the key items, one of the big victories that the Malayan political establishment want to talk about is, of course, the constitutional amendment. This idea, of course, is not new. VK Liu under Pakatan Harapan tried to do it, but they could not get support from GPS or the Sarawak Barisan National, so the thing fell apart. But under the Muhyiddin and Ismail Sabri government that came in, they were able to pass this amendment. I think the way to understand this amendment is that basically it doesn't really change anything. The most important thing was that it sort of changed slightly the mindset and changed the way that the Malay political establishment look at the MA historical grievances. They sort of slowly becoming to understand why this is such an emotive or big issue in Sabah and Sarawak. even in terms of changing slightly the Constitution Article 1, just put Sabah and Sarawak on a separate line. Of course, the amendments have other components, which is very important. So who is regarded as a native, especially in Sarawak, will now be decided under the Sarawak state government definition. And of course, GPS will take credit for this because the minister in charge who pushed the amendment through is, of course, from Sarawak. But for me, the most important thing, of course, is that although it's highly symbolic, at least now under the Constitution, the word Malaysia Agreement is now in the federal Constitution. So prior to this amendment, right, if you had looked through the Malaysian Constitution, you actually could not find the word Malaysia Agreement. So it's extremely important that we now have the word Malaysia Agreement in the federal Constitution. So this is what you wanted to hear from me. What is the political options? So I've given you the setting, the environment in which we're working under. So now I want to go through with you what are the political options to deal with the sort of grievances that I've just outlined in the last 20 minutes. So basically what I've done is put these political options into 4 different categories. The first one is easy political options. This thing can be done fairly easily. Second one is, of course, something that's much harder. Third and the fourth are things that are very, very hard or very, very hard to do. So these are the options 3 and 4 that I suppose a lot of people in this seminar want to hear about. So in terms of the easy political choices the government can make or the political class can make is, of course, they can rapidly implement the agreed items. As I mentioned, during the Pakatan time, they agreed on 17 out of 21 items. This was carried through the Muhyiddin and Ismail Sabri government. They are in the process of implementing it, but I understand there's some bureaucratic roadblocks. So if there's political will to implement this fast, they can actually do it. This is quite an easy political choice. The other area is, of course, autonomy in key appointments. You can give the appointments of things like the Director of Public Health, Education, State Police Chief, the University Vice Chancellors can all give this to the state government of Sabah and Sarawak. He can, of course, give more symbolic gestures by providing more TV and radio programs on Sabah and Sarawak funded by the federal government. And of course, he can always give one-off grants to build better infrastructure. He can also grant autonomy powers in areas like tourism, environment, which is not mentioned in the state list. As you know, the way federal state system works in Malaysia is that there's basically 3 lists about who controls what. The first is the federal list, the items controlled by the federal government. Second is the state list, items controlled by the individual states, and the concurrent list. Another item that can be done fairly easy is land. There's actually quite big blocks of land in both Sabah and Sarawak, which is under the control of the federal government. The federal government took this land away because the federal government claimed that they want to do something with this land. A lot of this land are actually left empty, and there's been some unhappiness in both state governments. So the federal government can actually return the unused lands and put it under the control of the state government of Sabah and Sarawak. Now, the second item that is much harder to deal with politically is, of course, the formula. As you know, the 40% rebate to Sabah is actually written in the Constitution. They've been arguing about this for quite a number of years. They cannot settle on a formula. I think this can be done quite easily because at the end of the day, it's really an accounting issue. It's really whether the government want to accept a formula put up by different parties. It's a choice. And this is not a very hard thing to do. It's really, it's actually a political choice. Second item is the role of Petronas in both Sabah and Sarawak. As you know, Sabah and Sarawak are really unhappy, as I mentioned, with the 5% royalty. So in some ways, you can actually, Petronas is 100% owned by the federal government and reports directly to the Prime Minister. He can actually tell Petronas that in terms of downstreaming all the contracts, you can actually channel this to Sabahans and Sarawakians. This can be done easily. So, but politically, it's much harder compared to the first list, but it can be done. In terms of the state civil service, you can allow the state civil service of Sabah and Sarawak to take over several federal functions. So the federal secretary in both states, you can make them into liaison roles rather than actually controlling some federal departments operating in both states. I think this will go a long way. Again, it's much harder to do politically, but can be done. And of course, you can put in Sabah and Sarawak representative in all major institutions. For example, there's no Sarawak representatives in the income tax board. And of course, as I mentioned earlier in the first part of my presentation, you can allow for more accurate history to be taught in schools throughout Malaysia. Now, item number 3, these are very hard political choices, and this is something that the federal government and the Malay political class will have to decide whether they want what to do. As I mentioned, currently things like tourism environment is not in the state list. You can actually create a special change that do amendment to federal constitution and put this under the state list, or you can create an amended state list, a special state list just for Sabah and Sarawak. Can be done, but it's a very hard political choice. Second area where it's a very hard political choice is to allow the state governments in both states to appoint judicial commissioners. Previously, they had power, but it was taken away. And you have to put in the constitution to make sure that anything to do with cases related to Sabah and Sarawak, you require a judge from those states so that they have an understanding of the local context. Another very hard political choices, if you want to do, is you can change the Petronas Act and increase the royalty by changing the actual agreement itself. Again, it is a very hard political choices because I think there's very little appetite in the Malay political class to change the 5% thing. The other thing that you can change, of course, is the territorial CS and however this rights to the individual states. You can also give Sabah and Sarawak full autonomy in finance, education, and security. Security is a big issue in Sabah, especially with the so-called people coming over Mindanao, as you know, led to several big incidents in the last 10 years. You can also relook at the IGC recommendations. Some of the IGC recommendations were actually not implemented in 1963. Some of them are actually quite interesting, and that requires, again, a change to the federal constitution. Again, a very hard political choice to be made. Now, the fourth one is a really, really hard political choices. This is where a lot of the key issues have to be dealt with. In item number 4, the very, very hard political choices, I would argue that at the present moment, I don't think there's a political appetite to deal with this, but these are some things that will have to be dealt with sooner or later. That even if you do not want to deal with it now, it will lead to situations where you have to deal with it over the long term. The first, of course, is the 1/3 of seats in Parliament. Initial discussion have started, but I would argue that there is no political appetite to do this in the near term. Certainly not after GE15. So don't expect to see this to change over the next 5 or 6 years. When it comes to the 1/3 seat issue, it is not as simple as people think, because it not only encompasses the Dewan Rakyat, but you also have to look at the issue of Dewan Negara, the upper house, the Senate. Right now, the big problem is the Senate, where Sabah and Sarawak each get 2 seats in the Dewan Negara. They selected 2. The other appointees from Sabah and Sarawak are actually appointed directly by the king. In the lower house, Sabah and Sarawak is about 26% of all the seats. So they want to increase it to 1/3. So the idea is that if Sabah and Sarawak control 1/3, this will go back to the original founding ethos in 1963, where Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore control 1/3, so that the Malayan political establishment cannot amend the federal constitution without the support of Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore. You can also look at new federal state structure. This is, again, something that is very, very difficult to do, because this will probably mean decentralization, and you may have to amend the federal constitution to codify the autonomy items. Another very hard political choices you have to do is the issue of complete political autonomy. There are groups in Sabah and Sarawak which argues that Malayan political parties should stay out of Sabah and Sarawak. Right now, Malayan political parties can be found in Sabah. They're part of the ruling government. But in Sarawak, there are Malayan political parties who are registered in Sarawak. For example, PAS, but they've never been able to capture power. But if you allow them complete political autonomy, this means that you won't allow these things these parties to set up branches in both Sabah and Sarawak. Now, in terms of very hard choices in Sabah, the big issue is, of course, the PTI issue. As I mentioned, 1/3 of Sabah's population is born outside Sabah. The question is that, do the federal government want to give Sabah complete autonomy on this issue? Because you're talking about things like revolting citizenship and mass deportation. Right now, all these powers are held by the federal government. So this is a very, very hard political choice that the federal government will have to deal with. Another very, very hard political choices the federal government have to deal with is, of course, in Sabah, they're calling for the return of the Labuan Island to the Sabah state. There is increasingly political consensus in Sabah that giving Labuan to the federal authorities was a mistake, because the original rationale for giving, of course, is that Labuan will be turned into a big, a big successful offshore financial center and duty-free zone. That has never happened. Very hard political choices. What do you do with the role of Islam or Islamic authorities? Sarawak is the only state without state religion, while Islam is the official state religion in Sabah. So what role do you want to give to Islam or the Islamic authorities? As I mentioned earlier, one of the original things in MA 63, of course, it stated quite clearly that there was not supposed to be a state religion in both states. Another very hard political choice is that you have to consciously not integrate Sabah and Sarawak and allow them to grow their own political culture. Here I'm talking about the grievance I talked about, which is the export of the Malayan political culture or Malayan political model into Sabah and Sarawak. There's a very strong push to adopt the same political culture. And one of the hard political choices, which is very difficult, is that you leave Sabah and Sarawak alone and let them build their own political culture. Another very, very hard thing that you have to deal with is whether you want to guarantee certain number of people from Sabah and Sarawak in the federal cabinet. Under the Malaysian system, it's widely understood that in terms of appointments to the federal cabinet, it is at the absolute discretion or the prerogative of the Prime Minister. If you treat Sabah and Sarawak as an equal partner, then you might want to look at the issue of whether you want to guarantee a quota in the federal government. Again, very, very hard political choices. And finally, there's been talk about a new MA agreement. But I can tell you that although there's talk about this, there is no support among the political class in Sabah and Sarawak to relook at the agreement. So these are the very hard political choices. So my final comment on MA 63 grievances and the political choices is that we have reached an interesting milestone. As I mentioned, this issue has blown up at the federal level in 2008 because you require the MPs from Sabah and Sarawak to stay in power. So since then, they play a major role. Now, this coming GE15 will be interesting because there are some people saying that, the Malay community in Peninsular Malaysia, the Malay voters do not like a lot of things that's been happening for the last few years, where we had lots of political instability, and that they may help Barisan Nasional or Perikatan Nasional or whoever get 2/3 majority. If one political entity wins 2/3 majority, then I can guarantee you that the MA 63 issues will be completely sidelined. Because once they no longer requires the MPs from Sabah and Sarawak to stay in power, they will just sideline the MA 63 issues. I've spoken to some members of the Malay political class, and the impression I get from them is that a lot of them are also hold the view that the 2021 amendments is enough to satisfy Sabah and Sarawak for now. So there's very little appetite to give in more to the demands of Sabah and Sarawak. So the best case scenario for GE15 is, of course, that Sabah and Sarawak continue to hold power. In other words, the political establishment in Peninsular Malaysia do not get a clear majority, and they require people on Sabah and Sarawak to stay in power. So they have to look at the MA grievances seriously. So to summarize up, I think it is quite clearly in terms of the political options, they require a real mindset change among the Malayan political establishment, especially the Malay political establishment that is dominant in Peninsular Malaysia. This may require the notion or the acceptance of this idea of equal partnerships. And the key issue is really the ideology of Ketuhanan Melayu Islam and whether you can force the people of Sabah and Sarawak to accept this. Clear mindset change, of course, require thinking that the Federation of Malaysia, when it was established in 1963, was really built on diversity, not on this idea that we're trying to create a Malay state. So if you want to read some of my writings on MS63, you can just Google ResearchGate James Chin 7, and all my writings are public. They're all there for everyone to read. So thank you very much again for the kind invitation from the Sabah and Sarawak Unit in the Prime Minister's Department, and I'll hand back to the host. Thank you.
Thank you.